Constitutional crisis looming. Pakistan appears to be on the verge of a constitutional breakdown, with state institutions, including the judiciary, clashing both internally and with the government. The refusal of the government to comply with a Supreme Court ruling has intensified this conflict. Government's defiance and judiciary tensions. The government, backed by the military, is resisting the Supreme Court's July 12th ruling to grant the PTI its reserved seats in Parliament. This defiance is compounded by a growing divide within the judiciary, especially between the outgoing Chief Justice and senior judges. Election Commission's role. The Election Commission of Pakistan, ECP, has been accused of bias and defying court orders, contributing to the political crisis. The government's alliance with the ECP is viewed as an attempt to undermine the judiciary and consolidate power by preventing PTI's return to the political field. Judicial reforms and government's plan. The government is pushing for constitutional amendments to curtail the judiciary's powers, framing it as part of a judicial reform package. This move has been accompanied by changes in election rules, further deepening the crisis. Majority judgment on PTI's rights. The Supreme Court's majority judgment asserts that denying PTI its right to parliamentary representation is illegal. Even dissenting judges agreed that PTI cannot be denied its reserved seats. Noncompliance by the government threatens to escalate the crisis, leading to institutional breakdown. Erosion of state institutions. The ECP's actions, along with the government's refusal to accept court rulings, undermine the legitimacy of state institutions. The judiciary is now in a critical position, as it must defend its authority and maintain the rule of law amid internal divisions and external pressures. Crux. Pakistan is facing a serious constitutional crisis as the government refuses to comply with a Supreme Court ruling on PTI's reserved seats in Parliament. Internal tensions within the judiciary, coupled with the Election Commission's controversial role, have deepened the political turmoil. The government's efforts to curtail judicial powers and its defiance of court rulings threaten to erode the legitimacy of state institutions, risking a breakdown of the political system. UN Summit on Climate Change. The Summit for the Future, launched ahead of the 79th UN General Assembly, aims to address stalled global efforts on climate change. However, early indications suggest that divisions between countries may hinder progress. Jakarta's struggles with climate change. Jakarta, Indonesia, serves as a stark example of the impact of climate change on the global south. The city faces rising sea levels, poor air quality, and excessive rainfall, which may leave large parts submerged by 2050. This has led Indonesia to move its capital to Nusantara on Borneo Island. Climate challenges for megacities. Jakarta's issues mirror some of Karachi's challenges, such as urban sprawl, flooding due to torrential rains, and the urban heat island effect, where concrete structures increase temperatures in built-up areas. Poorer regions of Karachi, with little vegetation and limited access to electricity, are most vulnerable to extreme heat and floods. Government inaction. Both Jakarta and Karachi suffer from corruption and lack of political will, worsening their environmental crises. Jakarta's move of its capital is seen as a temporary fix rather than a solution, much like Karachi's problems could be resolved with better urban planning and policies, but are held back by similar governance failures. Global disparities in climate action. The gap between Western climate policy experts and those affected by climate change in the global south remains wide. The global focus on other crises like the Middle East conflict risks diverting attention from climate issues, rendering high-level summits like the one in New York largely ineffective. Crux. The UN Summit for the Future aims to revitalize global climate action, but growing divisions between countries hinder progress. Jakarta, Indonesia's sinking capital, illustrates the devastating impact of climate change on megacities in the global south, a fate shared by Karachi. Both cities face environmental challenges, worsened by corruption and lack of political will. Climate policies discussed in global forums often fail to address the real struggles faced by these regions, further widening the gap between rich and poor nations. Parliamentary sovereignty in Pakistan versus Britain. A.V. Dicey's 19th century theory of British parliamentary sovereignty has been diluted over time, and Pakistan's constitutional framework differs significantly. In Pakistan, the constitution, created by the people, is supreme rather than parliament. Constitutional balance. Pakistan's 1973 constitution maintains a balance of power between the judiciary, executive, and legislature. However, the current government is attempting to upset this balance by undermining judicial independence and demanding judicial obedience. Judicial independence and fundamental rights. Fundamental rights and an independent judiciary are core features of the Constitution. The judiciary is entrusted to protect fundamental rights, and no law inconsistent with these rights can stand. Attempts to dilute judicial independence are seen as unconstitutional and threaten democracy. Judicial power. The Constitution vests judicial power exclusively with the judiciary, as highlighted by Justice Qazi Faiz Issa in a 2015 ruling where he struck down a constitutional amendment allowing civilians to be tried by military courts, defending the principle that fundamental rights cannot be diluted. Government's current actions. The government is undermining the judiciary through rushed legislation, such as amendments to election laws and the 2023 Supreme Court Practice and Procedure Act, which alters how benches are formed, diminishing the judiciary's independence. These amendments are aimed at reversing court decisions and centralizing power. Danger of constitutional crisis. The government's moves, bulldozing amendments through Parliament and attempting to create a two-thirds majority to weaken the judiciary, risk creating an unrepresentative legislature and a constitutional crisis. These efforts have parallels with the doctrine of necessity used in Pakistan's judicial history to justify undemocratic actions. Call for unity. The article ends by emphasizing that attempts to undermine judicial independence should unite the people in defense of the Constitution, which protects democracy and fundamental rights. Crux. The 1973 Constitution ensures a balance between the judiciary, executive, and legislature, with the judiciary's independence crucial to protecting fundamental rights. However, the government is undermining this balance through rushed legislation, weakening judicial independence, and threatening democracy. This situation echoes past undemocratic interventions in Pakistan's history and risks a constitutional crisis. The article calls for unity in defending the Constitution and judicial independence. Israel's recent actions. The Netanyahu government's recent military actions, including booby-trapping adversaries' communication devices, are described as provocative and qualify as war crimes under international law. These actions have led to mass casualties, particularly through airstrikes, and may trigger responses from Hezbollah and possibly Iran. U.S. double standards. The U.S. State Department maintains a list of state sponsors of terrorism, which notably excludes Israel, despite its history of actions that could be considered state-sponsored terrorism, both in the occupied Palestinian territories and across its region. The U.S. has a history of supporting Israeli military excesses, while ignoring the terrorist pasts of some Israeli leaders, such as Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir. Historical context. The article draws parallels between Israel's current actions and past atrocities, like the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982, which was overseen by Israeli General Ariel Sharon. Although Sharon faced mild reprimand, he later became Israel's prime minister, demonstrating a pattern of impunity for Israeli leaders. U.S. role in global violence. The article argues that the U.S., despite its position as an international arbiter, has been the greatest purveyor of violence globally, sponsoring or directly participating in conflicts across the world. Its support of Israel is a key example of this, as the U.S. continues to provide Israel with military aid despite its actions in Gaza and the West Bank. Netanyahu's motivations. Unlike his predecessors with military backgrounds, Benjamin Netanyahu's political maneuvers seem more focused on retaining power and avoiding legal challenges related to corruption. His administration's aggression towards Palestinians, including the annexation of the West Bank and the Gaza genocide, is driven by political survival. Potential wider conflict. There is uncertainty about whether Hezbollah or Iran will respond to Israel's provocations, which could escalate into a larger regional conflict. The U.S. remains complicit in Israel's actions, unless it takes meaningful steps, such as halting arms shipments to Israel. Crux. The Netanyahu government's recent military actions, including booby-trapping devices and airstrikes, qualify as war crimes and could provoke wider regional conflict involving Hezbollah and Iran. The U.S. continues to support Israel despite its history of state-sponsored terrorism and international violations. This reflects a broader pattern of U.S. global violence and hypocrisy, particularly in its unwavering military support for Israel. Netanyahu's actions are politically motivated, primarily aimed at retaining power and avoiding legal challenges, while the ongoing genocide in Gaza and annexation of the West Bank could trigger further regional instability. Government defiance. The government has openly stated it will not implement a ruling issued by the full bench of the Supreme Court, undermining the authority of the judiciary. Attacks on judiciary. Social media and television channels are broadcasting direct attacks on the judiciary, encouraged by the government's adversarial stance. This has weakened the judiciary's standing and effectiveness. Judiciary's internal conflict. Supreme Court judges are publicly disagreeing with each other, which has further eroded the institution's credibility and unity. These internal rifts are being exploited by the government. Government's legitimacy. The current government lacks public legitimacy due to its creation through engineered political maneuvers. Its legislative agenda reveals its true priorities, which do not align with democratic principles. Parliament's role. Parliament has compromised its own status by being complicit in weakening the separation of powers. Lawmakers' repeated assertions of parliamentary supremacy are seen as hollow, especially given their actions. Oppositions in action. The main opposition party is too focused on its leadership's personal struggles, neglecting to engage with the broader public or represent their concerns. Supreme Court's role. The public had looked to the Supreme Court to resolve key political and legal disputes. Although the full court issued a ruling, the Chief Justice's public disagreements with fellow judges are undermining the court's ability to maintain authority. Chief Justice's responsibility. It is the Chief Justice's duty to protect the integrity of the judiciary and ensure the respect of its rulings. His internal conflicts with other judges are being weaponized by the government, which is further destabilizing the institution. Crux. The state's constitutional framework is being dismantled, with the government openly refusing to implement a Supreme Court ruling and attacking the judiciary. The Supreme Court is plagued by internal conflicts, which the government is exploiting to weaken the institution. Parliament has compromised its role by undermining the separation of powers, and the main opposition is too distracted by internal leadership issues to effectively challenge these developments. The Chief Justice must take a stand to protect judicial independence before it is too late. Escalation of violence. The conflict has escalated into what is being termed the Third Lebanon War, with Israel bombing southern Lebanese towns and villages, primarily Hezbollah strongholds. Nearly 500 Lebanese civilians were killed in a single day, and the death toll has surpassed 550. Lebanon's reaction. Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati has condemned the actions as a war of extermination, while the Lebanese health minister reports hundreds of fatalities and over 1,800 injuries. Hezbollah has retaliated by launching rockets at Israel. Civilian targeting. Israel's bombardment is being criticized for indiscriminately killing civilians, revealing a disregard for the laws of war and proportionality. The rigging of civilian communication devices, attributed to Israel, has been labeled an act of terrorism. Netanyahu's shift in focus. The Israeli government, led by Benjamin Netanyahu, has shifted its military campaign from Gaza to Lebanon after failing to defeat Hamas in Gaza or retrieve hostages captured during last year's October 7th events. Despite its efforts, Hamas remains resilient, and Hezbollah's attacks from the north are adding pressure on Israel. Regional impact. The conflict is causing mass displacement in northern Israel and southern Lebanon. Lebanon, already suffering from economic woes, faces further instability. Hezbollah has stated it will cease fire if a Gaza ceasefire is established, but Israel and the U.S. have been blocking such efforts. Grim outlook. With the violence intensifying in both Lebanon and Gaza, hopes for a ceasefire are fading, and the region is at risk of broader destabilization. Crux. The conflict in Lebanon has escalated into a full-blown war, with Israel's bombings killing hundreds of civilians. Hezbollah is retaliating, and the situation is worsening as efforts for a Gaza ceasefire stall. Lebanon's economic crisis will likely deepen due to Israeli aggression, while Israel's campaign in Gaza and Lebanon has so far failed to achieve its goals, creating a grim outlook for the region's stability.